Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Foreign Policy and Technology conversation. I'm Allison Ford, and I serve on the board of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. We are a network of international affairs professionals dedicated to advancing women's leadership, amplifying their voices through substantive global issues programming, and preparing the next generation for leadership through mentoring. The WFPG launched our Foreign Policy and Technology series last year in 2019 to help educate policymakers on the implications of new technologies on foreign policy, development, and the global community. I'd like to take a moment to recognize my fellow board member, Michelle Lynch, and our executive director, Kim Konhauser-Freeman, for all of their work bringing together such excellent speakers for this entire series. I'd also like to take a minute to thank Kim specifically for her incredible leadership of the organization during this unprecedented time in our history. Kim, all you have done to ensure the adaptation of our programming to a virtual format has been fantastic. So well done and thank you. Today, I am delighted to welcome all of you to our conversation on combating misinformation in times of crisis, or rather tonight. I know this is a little later than we're used to on the East Coast, but thank you for those of you that are tuning in. Our speakers have a lot to cover, and I know that you're all going to have a lot of questions, so please don't be shy. If at any point during the program you have a question, you can enter it into the question box, which should be to the right of your screen. And our moderator will include as many as she can during the Q&A portion of the program. Today's conversation will be led by Amy Studdart. Amy is a senior advisor of digital diplomacy at the International Republican Institute. Amy regularly speaks and writes on tech's impact on democracy and society, the rise of digital authoritarianism, and the digital economy. So Amy, thank you for joining us, and I will go ahead and hand it over to you to lead the rest of the conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Allison. And thank you to all of you for attending, and to Kim for putting together this wonderful group. I am so delighted to be here in my house on the screen, but kind of with all of you. And I hope I'll have the chance to participate in real world Women's Foreign Policy Group events in the future. Just a quick note on run of show. So before I introduce Audrey, which I'm so excited to do, but a quick note on run of show, just so everyone knows so how this is gonna run. First of all, Audrey and I are gonna have a conversation to begin with about the kind of broader issues and the Taiwanese response. We're then gonna invite two other absolutely amazing panelists to join the conversation, and I will introduce them a little bit later. And then at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions, and I'll be having those questions fed through to me. A couple of things just to flag: this is completely on the record, so all of our speakers should be aware of that. I think they already are, but all of you who are asking questions, please do note that those are on the record as well. And so with that, let me introduce Audrey Tang, who is someone that I have admired from afar for years and years and years and years, and have just been absolutely delighted to have more opportunities to work with over the last few years. So Minister Tang is Taiwan's first digital minister. She was really active in the civic tech movement in Taiwan before digital minister was a thing, and really, you know, one of the reasons that I found her work and all of the people that she's worked with so inspiring is because it's this optimistic take on what the future can be that really embraces technology to say this can advance democratic principles. And so our conversation today is kind of a little bit on the negative side, right? You know, misinformation is this nasty subject in which we see all kinds of bad actors exploiting the internet to abuse people, to mislead people in ways that are unhelpful to democratic accountability and unhelpful to society writ large. But the way that Taiwan has approached that issue and the way that Minister Tang has led that approach has just been this kind of inspiring model. And so Minister Tang, I'll start there with a question that's really about how have you conceived of the misinformation crisis in Taiwan, particularly around the coronavirus, but I know that you were dealing with election-related misinformation and political misinformation before that. And if you could talk in particular how you've integrated civil society into that approach as well, that would be wonderful.
Certainly. Is my sound getting through? Can you hear me? Okay, that's excellent. So yeah, really happy to share our playbook, which is very easy to remember. It's called Fast, Fair, Fun, about countering not only the pandemic, but also the infodemic. We refer to misinformation in Taiwan, the unintentional, like conspiracy theories, panic buying, things that people have a legitimate concern to worry about. And we see this as a kind of epidemic of the virus of the mind, because if people do not get real-time clarifications from the government, if people do not get timely access to a scientist, of course, people are going to invent their own theories and travel on social media, or as I prefer to call it, anti-social media, that basically has the currency of anger and outrage. So if something that makes people feel worried about, actually one of the easiest way to do with that anxiety is just to click share. And then you feel better because more people are worried about it together. And just similarly, if you feel angry about something, it may or may not be true. Like the government is ramping up mass production in Taiwan from 2 million to 20 million masks per day. That part is true. And I quote, that is the same material as tissue paper, so we're going to run out of tissue paper very soon. Go out and panic buy, unquote. And that part is conspiracy theory. And then people will click share very easily because they don't want other people to be left stranded without tissue papers. Again, this is very natural. And so our way to counter it is called humor over rumor. The basic idea, very simply put, is that whenever there is a trending misinformation, and I mean not intentional, not deliberate, just normal conversation, we just introduce something that they can also share, but it's based on the idea of fun. So in terms of panic buying, for example, this is our prime minister. And he has a front side too. So maybe we look at his front side first. So he looks like this. But then 2 hours, not even 2 hours after the misinformation about panic buying started, he shows this in the social media, wiggles his bottoms a little bit, say in very large font, each of us only have one pair of buttocks. And this is a wordplay because stockpiling and buttocks in Mandarin sounds the same. And then with this very simple table that says, hey, the domestic production of the tissue papers will not interfere with tissue with the tissue paper makers because their material actually come from South America, while as the PPEs, they came from domestic materials. So these are totally unrelated. Now, if we only publish this table, nobody will remember it, nobody will share it. But because this meme, this picture literally is a tissue paper box. So people find it hilarious. And this maybe our R value of 5. Each person will share to 5 other friends. And then within a couple of days, the conspiracy theory just died down. You can just see people vaccinated in their mind. The next time they see the conspiracy theory, they laugh about it. And once they laugh about it, they literally cannot feel outrage. And this is not just a single shot thing. We have professional comedian groups in each ministry. For example, this is our social or physical distancing rule. When you're outdoors, you need to keep 2 dogs away. Indoor, keep 3 dogs away. And this is literally the spokesdog of the Ministry of Health and Welfare, which tells you not to, leave your mouth open when you're communicating. Don't put your hand to your mouth. Wear a mask to protect you from yourself. And remember to pre-order the masks. And so each of the scientific knowledge gets translated into something that's very easy to spread. And once they spread, they vaccinate people against future conspiracy theories and misinformation.
That's just wonderful. And I really wish that there was more humor around this crisis here too, because it would certainly make me feel a little bit less stressed about it all. So I was wondering as well, Audrey, if you could get into the collaboration that you've had with GovZero, with the COFAX line bot, and with other elements of civil society as well.
Certainly. So for people who are not familiar with the idea of GovZero, let me first introduce to you our work, because I'm still a civic technologist. I wear multiple hats. And so in Taiwan, most of websites that government provides as a service ends in something .gov.tw, such as join.gov.tw. And the civic tech sector, the social sector, if they don't like a particular website or if they think they can do it better, they would often register exactly the same domain, but with the O changed to a 0. So join the G0V.tw. And the great thing is that you don't have to pay for advertisement on social media. You just open your browser, open a random government website, change a O to a 0, and you get into the shadow government that's more fun and interactive and always open source, meaning that we relinquish most of our copyright so the government can adopt and merge this fork, this alternate imagination. And so GovZero, for example, during this crisis, did this wonderful map of mask availability. It shows you where nearby, for example, this pharmacy have this number of adult masks and this number of children's masks, and some pharmacy have run out of masks and things like that. And so people wouldn't needlessly queue when we start rationing our masks. And this is totally a social innovation. The government didn't anticipate any of this. It's just a random civic technologist in Taiwan how we're thinking it's a good idea to do so. And then they went ahead and completed this work. And I showed this to the premier, and the premier says we need to trust citizens with open data. So we convinced the National Health Agency, which covers more than 99.99% of people, not only citizens but also residents, to use your national health card, go to a nearby pharmacy, swipe the card, and you can get your ration, currently 9 medical masks per 2 weeks or 10 if you're a child. And you can see literally in more than 100 of those tools, maps and chatbots and voice assistants and all, that this stock level actually depletes in that pharmacy by 9 or 10 if you are a child within a couple of minutes, because the API is refreshed every 30 seconds when we introduce this thing. And so because of that, it becomes a participatory distributed ledger that everybody can hold each other accountable. So when we ramp out the mass production, everybody trusted that, not because of the government saying so, but because the GovZero civic technologists, now they call themselves civil engineers because their work has been used by tens of millions of people. So not unlike highways and roads, and that's excellent. And so in the case of the COFAX, which is another GovZero project, is the very simple idea that for each and every end-to-end encrypted channel, of which the government should have no business eavesdropping, each of us may flag something as spam. Just as we dedicate, for example, something in our inbox as spam, it sends the fingerprint to Spam House, which is the international organization in charge of looking at where people are sending spam and sending those to your junk mail box instead of your inbox. So COFAX works exactly the same. It's a simple line bot. And if you add it as a friend, you can forward each and every piece of disinformation, scam or whatever to this bot. And the bot will do a wiki clarification, that is to send it to a team of investigators to look at whether it is true or not. And Taiwan has 2 organizations as part of the International Fact-Checking Network. That's IFCN and the Taiwan Fact Check Center, and I think Michael Penn will look at the trending disinformation that people voluntarily share and dedicate their energy to the ones that are actually trending, so that we can roll out, as we say, from rumor to clarification on average now within 60 minutes, and at latest 2 hours in 2 pictures, each 200 characters or so. So because of that, we work with the journalist community, we work with the civic technologists to flag the ones that actually needs real-time clarification, because comedians, like professional comedians, only can focus their attention one thing at a time. So it's very good that we have kind of a radar from the civic society.
Wonderful, thank you. Just for the audience, a quick clarification on Line, because I know not all of you are as familiar with the social media landscape of Taiwan as Audrey and I are. Line is essentially the equivalent of a WhatsApp or a Signal. It's used by the majority of the population in Taiwan. There's a lot of family groups, and so over the last couple of years, it's one of the spaces where we've seen a lot of misinformation, health misinformation, and political misinformation, as well as the other areas in which misinformation spreads being shared quite a lot, particularly in an intergenerational fashion. So the COFAX line bot was developed to deal with that issue. Now, Audrey, I understand that it is very early there, 7 a.m., but I'm going to lob a question at you just because you're so articulate on this issue. You mentioned trust the people with open data. And of course, GovZero was sort of formed out of the open source movement, and a lot of the work that you do really pays heed to the principles of the open source movement. One of the things that's been really striking to watch in terms of Taiwan's really effective response is what you've done is you have embraced this open data principle that allows people to innovate, regular citizens to innovate, to have access to information. That runs in contrast to other countries, and particularly mainland China, which has, repressed information, even anecdotal information, and rather than sharing data, has seen that as a threat to its response to the crisis. And that's certainly true to varying degrees all over the world, I think. Taiwan has really been at the forefront of saying, no, the more data we publish, yeah, exactly. I love that. The more data we publish, the easier it'll be to collectively solve these problems. Could you talk a little bit about what open data looks like, what the open source movement looks like, and how you've made that central to the Taiwanese response to the coronavirus?
Certainly. So I already talked about making available the real-time distribution of the medical masks. And that is a really good example, because when you update something every 30 seconds, they become essentially open API. That is to say, people can look at the real-time information and compare their experiences with the data. And the pharmacists, they are essentially data producers in what we call a data collaborative. A data collaborative, such as COVAX, relying on people to voluntarily provide fact-check data, opens up the possibility for the social sector to set the agenda for the public sector, flagging this to our attention, and for the economic sector also to join in to scale out the operation. For example, the COVAX database is also used by the Trend Micro, which is the leading antivirus company in Taiwan. They have another bot called the Dr. Message that essentially, if you invite it to your intergenerational solidarity group on the Line platform, then it behaves just like an antivirus program. It scans each incoming message without storing it, and then it compares it to known scams and known disinformation campaigns and things like that, and offer real-time clarifications to help your family members. But again, this comes initially from the citizens science. And another good case of open data is Airbox. So around Taiwan, there's tens of thousands of those small measurement stations that measures PM2.5 and other air quality indicators. And as you can see here, in the south part of Taiwan, the air may not be that good around that time of the day. Actually, after coronavirus, this looks much greener. This is pre-coronavirus, but in any case, I know, right? So people who care, often primary school teachers or people who donate their balcony to install such boxes, which are very inexpensive. It's just less than $100 per box. And because our 4G connection is guaranteed to work anywhere in Taiwan, its broadband is human right. For just $16 per month, you get unlimited data, even on the top of Taiwan, almost 4,000 meters high. And so everybody can join this data collaboratives voluntarily and very willingly. And at that time, when GovZero first doing this air map thing with the Airbox community, there was only less than 100 weather stations measuring the precision of the PM2.5 run by the government, by the environment minister. But in the civil society, there's thousands of those stations, and they're in close proximity to where people live. So of course, you're going to believe the social sector numbers instead of the environment minister's numbers, and that causes a legitimacy crisis for the environment minister. But because I just showed that Taiwan is really, according to the Civics Monitor, the only completely open civil society in terms of freedom of assembly and speech in the whole of Asia, that means that we cannot beat the civil society. We must join the civil society. And so we worked with them to make a civil IoT platform, and they negotiated with the public sector saying, okay, we see some gaps here, and these are industrial parks, industrial areas, private property. Of course, your local primary school teacher cannot break in and install airboxes there. Turns out that we own the lamp in the industrial parks, so we can install their design of weather sensors and proximity to the industrial parks on the lamp in the park area. And so that is essentially essentially reverse procurement. In traditional PPP, it's the public sector setting agenda for the private sector to implement and the social sector to educate. And this is the social sector pressuring the government of a better way of working, a new norm, and pressuring the private sector to basically work with what the people have specified. And that is the power of open data as a civil society agenda setter.
So I'm going to come back to this question about the private sector in just a second, but I'd love for you to expand on this concept of trust. The coronavirus, I think the first rumors of the coronavirus having come to Taiwan started in Taiwan the day before the presidential election in January. The year before that had really been characterized by a lot of misinformation, disinformation that reduced trust in the government. And yet, the DPP wins in January, you're back, you suddenly have to deal with this crisis all on the basis of, with this background of a real lack of social trust, or at least it seemed that way to an outside observer. How did you think about trust in that context? You've mentioned humor, you've mentioned open data. How did you rebuild, or how did you establish enough trust between the people and the government that the people would listen to what the government was saying?
Yeah, I always say that the government need to trust its citizens, and the citizens may or may not trust back. That's the nature of trust. And I have a principle called radical transparency, but it often gets reinterpreted. So I'll make it very clear. In Taiwan, when we say radical transparency, we mean making the state radically transparent to the people, including the budget, the KPIs, everything in the national participation platform. In some other jurisdiction, of course, it means making the citizens transparent to the state or to the party, and we're not that kind of jurisdiction, just for the record, because we're on the record. And so when you do radical transparency from the state to the citizen, for example, I'm currently in the Social Innovation Lab. It's literally a park. Everybody can just walk in from that glass door. Everybody can see I'm streaming from the glass door, and then ask me anything, really, every Wednesday from 10 a.m. To the evening. So basically, everyone can demand an account from me, whether they want to know how digital fence or digital quarantines program works or how the mass distribution works. They can find me very easily. And during the pandemic, our Central Epidemic Command Center hosts daily press conferences, and the agenda is again set by the people. Not only do they answer all the journalists' questions, but if anyone called this hotline, which is 1922, this is old technology called landline, toll-free number, and then you just call it. Like one day in April, there was a young boy who said, I only get pink medical mask in my local pharmacy because when you ration, you don't get to pick the color. And he doesn't want to go to school because he thinks his classmates may laugh at him for wearing a pink medical mask. Well, the very next day, the press conference, the daily press conference, everybody in CCC, regardless of gender, started wearing pink medical mask, and pink became the most hip color just overnight. So making sure everybody learns about gender mainstreaming. And so this kind of fast response builds trustworthiness. And I think this concept of trustworthiness, of earned trust, is much more fruitful to talk about than abstract trust, as if it's a level of trust in the society. So when there was election misinformation about, for example, my favorite example, because it's always the CIA, there was a something that says the CIA made special ink, so no matter who you vote, Tsai always wins, just before our presidential election. And the way we counter it is, again, by encouraging YouTubers of all the different parties to live stream the counting process. In Taiwan, you're allowed to record, and from different angles, the counting process, where people just take out those paper ballots and announce it to all the observers. And once those popular YouTubers, and they each arm themselves with this app that counts by their own. And so you really see there really is no room for invisible ink or some other kind of shenanigans in the counting process. So radical transparency from the states to the citizens earns trust and increased trustworthiness.
That's a really wonderful answer. I'd also add to that it eliminates the need for trust. You don't have to assume that your government is doing right by you because you can track it and monitor it, right? I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to invite our panelists to turn on their video and join the conversation. So be prepared for that, panelists. But my final question to you, Audrey, is, I think one of the challenges for a lot of societies in navigating misinformation is that it requires such close collaboration with the private sector, and particularly with social media platforms. Taiwan has been navigating this now for a couple of years, to varying degrees of success, depending on which platform it is. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the role that you think technology platforms need to play in combating mis and disinformation themselves, and how the government of Taiwan has worked with social media platforms in ways that are effective and potentially replicable elsewhere.
Well, our domestic social media platforms, such as PTT, which was originally really the way that we respond so quickly starting last year to counter the pandemic, was because in our local equivalent of Reddit, the PTT, has somebody with the name No More Pipe reposting a certain post from Dr. Li Wenliang, the PRC whistleblower, saying there's 7 new SARS cases. So literally at the same hour when Dr. Li Wenliang gets investigated and called to a meeting to his institution, he would later get punishment from local police institution for disrupting the harmony. In PTT, people are upvoting that post, and our medical officers immediately noticed the post and issued orders saying that all passengers flying in from Wuhan to Taiwan need to start health inspection the very next day, the first day of 2020. And so this says 2 things, right? This says the civil society trusts the government enough, and the social media platform, in this case PTT, is a pro-social media platform, and the medical officers actually take it seriously and treat it as if SARS happened again, something we've always been preparing since 2003. Now, of course, I'm not pretending all social media platforms are domestic. There are semi-sovereign, semi-ambassadorship required with multinational social media platforms, and we rely on the power of social norms. In Taiwan, there is a separate branch in government called the corrective branch, and the Control Yuan is the official name, the Jiancha Yuan. The Control Yuan publishes all the campaign spending and all the campaign donation of each and every national level central election campaign. And we lobbied and actually did civil disobedience for quite a while in the Gap Zero movement to lobby for the Control Yuan to release the raw data, each and every single expense and donation item, so people can do independent analysis on political contributions. And it first got signed into law and went into effect on the 2018 mayoral election. And then we saw some glaring gaps. We saw that the social media advertisements were not filed as either campaign donation or campaign expense. So we have to talk to those multinational companies and say, look, we have a norm here in Taiwan. It's called radical transparency. You either publish your political advertisement with all its hyper precision, playbooks that some dark patterns that candidates use in real time in our format, or maybe you would consider stop running political advertisements around our elections and referenda. And otherwise, we understand our domestic law doesn't really affect you, but you may face social sanction. And that is really powerful because in Taiwan, social sanctions can very easily take a company down. And so by our presidential election, Facebook agreed to publish in real time the ads library that would enable the coverage of the dark patterns of hyper precision targeting if there were one, so no candidate dared to try that. And Google and Twitter simply refused to run political advertisement during our election session.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So Meredith and Hibah, I'm gonna invite you both to turn on your cameras and show us your lovely faces. Hi guys. Oh, you've disappeared again.
Yeah, I'm bracing for social impact.
Yeah, I know. Hi, Meredith. While Hibah turns on her camera, I'll just, oh, hi, Hibah. So this is just, the most incredible panel. So kudos to Women's Foreign Policy Group for putting this together. Before I introduce these amazing people, I would like to just remind everyone that you can post questions in the chat box, and those are being fielded through to me so that when we get to the Q&A period, we can try and get through as many of them as possible. So please do post your questions in the chat box because we'd love to hear from all of you. You're just the most incredibly distinguished group, and we know you have a lot of really really incredible contributions to make, so do that. Okay, so now introducing these wonderful people. So Meredith Broussard is a professor at NYU. She is also the author of a book, which you can buy and should buy, called Artificial Intelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. So yeah, go Google that, find it, buy it. I'm sure that you all have lots of reading time at the moment, and it's a really important topic to get your head around. We also have Hibah Kamal-Grayson. She's the public policy lead for Google Search's social impact verticals. So for those of you who don't fully understand the sort of Google product framework, so Google Search is the thing that everybody knows of as Google, and then there's a number of other products that fall under Google as well. So we'll talk to Hibah a little bit about Google Search in particular in this space. So Meredith, I would, oh, well done, an advertisement from Minister Tang for all of you. So Meredith, I'm going to come to you first. You know, I think AI has been such a controversial topic, and it's particularly controversial as it applies to health data. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've observed in this particular crisis, but just in general, how we should be thinking about the application of AI to crises like these and to this one in particular.
Well, thanks for having me, and that's a great question. One of the big confusions about AI is that people think that the Hollywood version of AI is real. And so it's very important to specify that that Hollywood concept of the Terminator or of robots that are going to take over the world, it's all totally imaginary. It's very wonderful to think about, but it's all totally imaginary. So what we're talking about when we're talking about AI that's real right now is we're talking about math. It's very complex and beautiful math, but it is nonetheless math. So when we're running AI on health data, we're doing mathematical analysis of health data. Sometimes we are parsing text. Sometimes we are looking at what are norms for medical test results for certain groups. These are all very concrete things that we're doing with AI. And so we need to think about the concrete things that we're doing with AI and think about what can go wrong. How can health data be disclosed unintentionally? Are we using secure methods of communication about health data? This is particularly acute during COVID because people are so eager to share data and so eager to do anything that's going to help with the crisis, which is completely reasonable. It is a completely reasonable human response in a crisis. But we do have to be careful about the safety of people's health data, the confidentiality of people's health data. Just because we have a crisis doesn't mean that we should willy-nilly get rid of all of our concerns about security. And we should also be reasonable about what we expect that AI will be able to do and won't be able to do. So there is sometimes a narrative that AI is going to save us, that somehow there's going to be some kind of AI-driven breakthrough in health. And yes, there's wonderful, wonderful work going on in computational biology, computational chemistry. There's all kinds of amazing things, especially in drug development. But we shouldn't look at AI as a magic bullet to say this is the one technology that's going to save us.
And so you mentioned that there are some strengths. Where have you seen those strengths applied? Have you seen any applications of AI, any version of it through this crisis and another health crisis where it could be useful in this context?
I have not personally, but I would invite my co-panelists to weigh in on this. I would love to hear if there is some kind of positive use in health.
So we'll come to that in just one second. So, you know, the main focus of this session is misinformation, and I think one of the challenges with AI is that the data sets that are used for machine learning and for other AI technology tend to be misinformed themselves. They amplify biases. They can reach the wrong conclusions because they are just these massive algorithms that are where we just don't have sufficient oversight, and we're not completely aware of what the prejudices in the data are. Could you talk a little bit about what those risks are specifically as it relates to health as well?
Sure. I think that one of the big risks is when it comes to inequality and the possibility that AI systems are going to reproduce existing health inequalities in the world. So there's this concept that data scientists and AI practitioners use that's called the unreasonable effectiveness of data. So people don't actually understand the math inside AI. Even the people who are writing AI systems often don't understand the math. This is one of the kind of dirty secrets of the AI world. But there's this principle called the unreasonable effectiveness of data, which means that we don't understand why it's working, but actually if you throw enough data at a problem, then the AI can guess a very specific answer very, very effectively, right? So if you have a whole lot of data about people's blood sugar levels or people's grocery store shopping habits, you can predict with reasonable accuracy who has diabetes, for example. So we have to think about the unreasonable effectiveness of data, think about what it shows, and then we also have to think about what do we know about health inequalities? What do we know about who has access to medical care and who doesn't? Well, it's rich people who have access to medical care, and it's poor people who don't. In America, who's rich and who's poor often breaks down along racial lines. And so we have racial groups with radically different health outcomes. So if we're just using AI to say, predict who is going to recover from COVID and who's not going to recover from COVID, well, it's not really a fair prediction, because what the algorithm is going to diagnose is it's going to diagnose that the rich people are going to recover more or at a higher rate because, according to the algorithm, well, the algorithm doesn't really care why. It just identifies that the rich people are going to recover more. But in truth, what it's doing is it's uncovering something that is more horrifying about American society, which is that wealthier people have better access to medical care and thus have better health outcomes. So if we use AI to decide, say, who gets treatment or who gets priority on an organ transplant list, like if we use AI for these important health considerations, we're not making decisions that are getting us toward a better world. We're simply reproducing existing inequalities. And we can also talk about gender equality in the world of AI. So I wrote something recently about non-binary individuals and representation in database systems. Most database systems are built so that gender is represented as male and female. And we know now that gender is a spectrum, that there are lots of ways to express gender. There are lots and lots of different categories of gender. We know that sex is different than gender, but this social knowledge is not reflected in most databases. And when it comes to medical databases, this is especially important because this is information that one needs to share with one's doctor, probably in certain circumstances. It might have diagnostic relevance, but it's not represented in the database. So we have a long way to go in terms of effective representation inside the databases, inside the mechanics of how we're representing information.
So Minister Tang, you are a brilliant computer scientist as well as a public official, so you've had to navigate this set of issues from both angles. How do you think about the application of AI in this space?
Using assistive intelligence, which is my preferred term for AI, to determine who gets treatment first in COVID or in ICU is illegal in Taiwan. It's just plain illegal, and it should be. And I think one of the most important thing when I call it assistive intelligence is just like a human assistant. We demand two things of our human assistants, right? We demand value alignment, meaning that they need to act in our own best interest. Otherwise, we don't call them assistants. We maybe call them mentors or something. But in the second thing is that we demand a account when we perceive something that they do that is not aligned with our values, and they may justify these actions. And when we demand these of our human assistants, that encourages pro-social behavior of such a human assistant. So machine assistants need to do the same. Otherwise, it's not part of the society. And in Taiwan, because we have a single-payer universal care health care system, it enables pro-social behavior that I often see that in the Western world that characterizes us as kind of collectivist or confusion, and that's very confusing to me, because to me it's all a rational choice. When you know that it will not incur social or financial burden if you're a person with less wealth than average, you will nevertheless be able to get medical meds from your nearby pharmacy and navigate to a local clinic and work with medical offices, not because you're pro-social, but because it's the logical thing to do, because you're not going to suffer financially or socially for it. And so this bedrock on which assistive intelligence is built is as important as any. And when there are emerging technologies, such as the classic example being self-driving vehicles being introduced in the society, it's not like the PEVs, the persuasive electric vehicles, as you can see here. And this is the lab, my office, by the way. This is how it looks on the outside. We allow them to roam free for a couple years here, and in very, very slow speed, like slower than a person running. And so these are just the self-driving tricycles that's co-domesticated with people, and it interacts with the nearby flower market, literally the Jianguo flower market where I got those flowers. And then I just get random, like an elderly couple walking by and say, "Minister, what are you doing with those shopping carts?" And I'm like, "These are not shopping carts. You hop on one, you tell it where to go, you drive you there very slowly." And they say, "No, this looks just like a shopping cart. What if we want to put the flower they just bought," I think it was orchid flower or something, into this basket, and then would it continue to run? And they'd actually try it and continue to run. And they're like, "Okay, we would love hands-free shopping." So on this weekends when they shop the Jianguo flower market, we would like this self-driving vehicle to follow us around, so we can just put everything we buy into this walking sidekick, if you will, and they hear something called platooning, where if something is full, you can step back, summon another self-driving vehicle, form a fleet, so they can do hands-free shopping for 2 hours or 3 hours, and then they can drive perfectly well, thank you, and so they don't really need the PEVs as an alternative to their car. And when viewed this way, the society determines the norm on which these assistive intelligence can integrate with the society. So we came up with a new design. It's open hardware after all. These two eyes are completely not for seeing because it uses LiDAR technology. It doesn't really need those eyes, but these eyes shows people who they are following around. And it does a lot of emotional and social signals, and this is me on this self-driving thing. And so now when we start rolling out after midnight, after the metro stopped working, self-driving buses of 9 people or 35 people in the dedicated bus lane, people already benefit from the 2 years of co-domestication with these self-driving creatures without worrying that they will change the social norm. Because in Taiwan, you first yield to the elders, and then to the handicapped people, and then to women, pregnant women especially, and then to children. But in Boston, where these AI are first trained, they yield to children and doesn't care at all about elders. And so because of the different social norms, if you don't grow up with assistive intelligence, then of course it will limit people's visions and limit people's imagination and reinforce bias imported from afar. But if people learn together, like I just showed with those self-driving vehicles, then it actually promotes social creativity.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So Hibah, I'm going to turn to you. Google search has become such an important piece of the medical information ecosystem. I can't tell you how many times I have been convinced that I have some incredibly rare disease and I'm about to die of something within the next 2 hours due to my first Google search. Oh, I have a headache. Okay, this is like something awful. So I imagine that in a crisis like this one, this is a really difficult issue for you guys to navigate. Could you explain a little bit about how you think about that responsibility and then how you've thought about it in the context of coronavirus as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks so much for having me. So yeah, I think this is such an important and timely discussion. If you're thinking about Google's approach to this issue, especially around coronavirus, we really have to go back to the beginning of this year, which feels like a lifetime ago, when we began to hear from some of our colleagues only in Asia about this new coronavirus. And at the time, it wasn't clear if the virus would spread globally or stay contained. It wasn't clear if outbreaks would be sustained or if they dissipate. But what was very, very clear was that there was a lot of anxiety, as you mentioned, around this, and that users needed easy access to authoritative information, and they needed it really quickly. So right when that happened, we launched something called an SOS alert, which is a search feature that we normally reserve for crisis situations like earthquakes and things like that. And we use this to prominently surface resources and safety information, first starting with the World Health Organization. And then immediately after that, we added localized public health guidance from government health authorities, starting where in places where the outbreak was especially bad and severe. So over time, this sort of SOS alert, which was just designed to get authoritative information out quickly, evolved into this full-blown search feature, which you'll see now if you search for coronavirus. And it has a lot more information, including local announcements from government agencies, authoritative news updates, new data and visualizations, and all of this complements, to get back to your earlier question about how we think of this more broadly, all of this complements pre-existing work on Google Search and Google News that recognizes sensitive events and contexts like health, like medical information, and elevates authoritative content in these contexts. So, for all of these, I think the key theme, if you haven't gotten it yet, is partnering with governments. It's been absolutely critical for all of this work that we've done around coronavirus on search. And it's because governments and public health authorities, they're the ones who are monitoring coronavirus on the ground. They're the ones who have locally relevant guidance for the folks who live in their countries. And so we viewed our role on search as partnering with them to surface these resources as quickly as possible to make sure that users have access to this information even when the situation evolves really, really quickly on the ground. I think that was a huge challenge too, is when the facts are changing so quickly.
This is, yeah, absolutely. This question of partnering with governments is a really fascinating one, and it's one that we deal with at IRI a lot of the time and have been doing with this particular issue. One of the things that we've seen in our work is that there's a lot of health misinformation in some countries that is being spread by the government, and this is particularly true in closed societies. How do you make that determination? How do you decide whether or not you're going to work with a public health agency that might not be sharing health information that's accurate or in the best interest of the people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's why at the very beginning we started with the World Health Organization and focusing more on global health authorities, although we all know that, people can disagree about global health authorities. So I do think that in this case, it was sort of a unique situation because most governments really did want to get information out to users. We just made sure that all of our search features have, we all have like a medical topics policy, which prevents what we consider to be medical misinformation from surfacing in these features, and that's publicly available as well. So in all of these features, if we find information that does not reflect scientific consensus or evidence-based best practices, we don't surface that information in our search features. But I do think that in this case, governments really did want to get this information out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So we have a few different questions from the audience. I am going to start at the top in the order that they came through. The first one is really for you, Minister Tang. Taiwan seems to have a fantastic sense of community that drives its government to be completely transparent. For other countries that are essentially fractured or ignore the facts, how do you move towards transparency without backlash? I wonder where that could be referring to.
Well, if in 2013, you ask a random person on the street in Taiwan whether there will be a minister that works in the park where you can just come by and say hi, very transparently, whether you will have a national participation platform that hosts more than 10 million unique visitors, that's almost half, actually more than half of the adult population, and so on. People would look you funny and think like it's impossible. The government works in a bureaucracy. It's a top-down structure with a lot of hierarchies and things like that. And so it's a new thing for us too, this direct democracy, participatory democracy thing. And this is partly thanks to YouTube live streaming, by the way, which is Google property now. What we have done when we occupied the parliament in 2014, asking for more transparency in the discussion of the Cross-Strait Service and Trade Agreement, CSSTA, at which time the MPs refused to deliberate like they would for other international negotiations. It's essentially people occupying the MP's seats with 500,000 people on the street and many more online, watching the live streaming and offering their good questions and comments, and looking at the demonstration, which is completely peaceful around the parliament. And I was one of the people of the GovZero project at the time, offering communication support so that it gets translated into multiple languages. The same technology will later on be exported and working in the umbrella movement. And all this basically says that anyone who cares enough about the CSSTA can join any of those 20 different NGOs hosting a nearby discussion. For example, people at that time really care about whether we allow component from PRC into our 4G basic infrastructure network, a conversation that's the world is having now on 5G. But in any case, our consensus on the street, rough consensus, which gets more solid every day, was no, there's no market player in telecommunication in PRC. We should not allow them in the 4G infrastructure. There's many other demands as well. And finally, the head of the parliament agreed on all the demands. And so that created a essentially a demonstration, a demo to people that you simply cannot ignore. And the political norm changed afterward. Everybody, every party, actually all the 4 parties in the parliament now signs on the open government partnerships, open parliament statements. And so you really cannot advocate for more close black box decision making in Taiwan and hope to be elected to MPs or mayorship options. Everybody has to at least say we want to make a little bit more contribution to open government. So my advice is not to occupy your parliament. My advice is to you look at the technologies, look at, for example, the crowd law at crowd.law playbook for the Congress, any Congress in the world, but this time I think it was designed for the US Congress, and use the tools that we have honed during the Occupy, after the Occupy, so that any average MP can use this to listen and scale and reflect people's true feelings through pro-social media that highlights people's common unified purposes and values instead of the bitter divisions that we see in anti-social media. So use those tools, promote more virtual town halls, use this pandemic as a amplifier to make sure that people who have a lot of time to read and think can make meaningful changes and make meaningful agenda setting on your local governance. I think it has been used to great effect. If you search for civic assembly, Polish civic assembly, a virtual town hall in Bowling Green, Kentucky, you will see such a very good experiment using exactly the same technology as we use on the township level.
Wonderful, thank you. Meredith, would you like to talk a little bit about social norms and misinformation as well?
Yeah, I wanted to, I've been thinking about social norms, Audrey, since you brought it up. And I wanted to say that one of the easy things that citizens can do to check if technology is in line with social norms is you can look for misinformation on the different platforms, right? So we know that there are there are a certain number of conspiracy theories. There are, campaigns of misinformation. And if you are, in a policy position, if you are in touch with the social media companies or in touch with the search companies, you can bring it to their attention and say, hey, listen, this is a problem. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression in the US by Safiya Noble that is a really fantastic book. And she noticed that on Google search, when she searched the term white girls, she got kind of wholesome images of girls. And when she searched the term black girls, she got pornography. Now that has since been fixed to Google's credit, but there are still issues. When you search professional hairstyles for work, you get images of white women. When you search unprofessional hairstyles for work, you get images of black women. So you can test these systems yourself to see what kind of equality or inequality is embedded in the systems. And then, you can raise the issue publicly. You can use the media. You can integrate this into policy discussions. Another thing to look at is whether search and social media companies have fact-checking operations in your country. So one of the things that I was surprised to discover after a couple of years ago when Facebook announced that it was launching fact-checking initiatives. It sounds like the fact-checking initiatives are working beautifully in Taiwan. They're not working so well in the US, but I was really surprised to discover that there was only fact-checking in, I think, 17 languages. Now, there are hundreds of languages in the world. There are hundreds of countries. So you can check, is there fact checking on social media in your country? And if there isn't, you can ask, why not? If there are different, different dialects, is there fact checking happening in all of these different dialects? Because this is very important in order to fight misinformation. If there's misinformation that's being or there's fact checking that's happening in only one of the dominant languages in your country, then that's a problem.
Yeah, and that's certainly something we see in our work all of the time. Minister Tang's just here for the book promos. I love it. Okay, so we are out of time for questions, but Hibah, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to Meredith, and there was one question that did come directly for you, so I'm going to give you that one as well. What do you do when a government doesn't want to get the truth out about COVID? Or any other crisis as well. So I'll give you 30 seconds to reply to that. Audrey, Meredith, if you have something burning that you want to say, you'll be given time too, but I know it's early in some places and late in others, so I would like to see us finish somewhat on time. Hibah, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. And I do want to clarify that we don't have these search features available everywhere. There are cases, in China, for example, where we don't offer Google search. So we don't have, bespoke search features there. And yeah, in cases where if a government doesn't have a dedicated coronavirus website with accurate, authoritative information, we won't surface that in special search features. I did want to just give a quick overview. If you want more information on how Google approaches mis and disinformation, we actually have a whole white paper on this topic, which you can pull up. We can get into the weeds and have a whole hour-long discussion on this, but I think the TLDR here is that we really do think that we take our responsibility really, really seriously, and we think that without dedication and transparency to how we remove mis and disinformation, that we won't really be able to uphold our mission. So we really focus on transparency around our policies, which you can find more information about in our white paper. And we also recognize that a lot of this is going to take collaboration with folks like Audrey, Meredith, you, Amy. It's going to take a multi-stakeholder effort. And so there has also been a lot of work to strengthen the broader ecosystem. Just around COVID specifically, we've done a lot to boost fact-checking capabilities, helping publishers who are smaller, news outlets report on COVID, add grants to public health authorities, things like that. We recognize that we can't do it alone.
Wonderful. What a note to end on. This has just been, for me, an absolute pleasure. What an honor to be on this panel with all of you. Huge thanks from me to the audience as well, and also to the Women's Foreign Policy Group, and especially Allison, Michelle, and Kim. Just a tremendous pleasure. Thank you. And with that, Allison, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you to everyone who spoke today on the panel and all of you who have provided such awesome questions from wherever you are, on your couch or wherever. Let's give a little round of applause or maybe a cheers. We hope that you'll stay connected and consider joining the WFPG as a member if you aren't already. If you are or are not and feel like donating, consider doing that as well. And we hope to see you at one of our upcoming programs, either virtually or hopefully in person very soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Live long, prosper.